Good morning. Good morning. Yep, I'm on. I'm working. Excellent. Welcome to St Andrew's Church. It's lovely to have everyone here this morning for this church family breakfast and to tackle a tricky topic. Obviously, the number of people here this morning shows what a relevant topic it is as well for our society at the moment. Thank you to those, first of all, who put on our wonderful breakfast this morning. Can we just give them a round of applause? You'll be delighted to know that there are pastries available in the foyer on your way out. If you'd like to take one home for you or your family, then help yourself as you leave. And also, welcome to anyone watching on the live stream. Thank you for joining us at home. It's lovely that you could be here with us as well. Or if you're watching later on, it's good that you could catch this important topic. Just to say the donations, thank you very much for being so generous in the donations. The breakfast was a gift from the men's breakfast team, but the donations will go towards Rwanda and Hope Gardens and our links with mission partners there. So thank you for your generosity in that. Also to say, by way of notice, at the end there will be time for some questions formally and then informally afterwards as well. And we also thought maybe offer some prayer ministry if anyone would like to pray about anything that's been stirred up in them this morning. Two of our prayer ministers are offering to support you in prayer over in the chapel there. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to hand over to our two doctors now. I think it's fairly safe to say we're in safe hands this morning with Dr. Charlie Besley and Dr. Claire Stark-Toller. Charlie's reputation goes ahead of him as a local GP. My first funeral I did when I arrived here, the family had been looked after by Charlie and they couldn't speak highly enough of him. So we're very, very grateful to have you, Charlie, handling this matter. Charlie moved from being a GP into palliative care. And we also have my wife, Claire, who is a consultant in palliative care. And she also helps edit palliative care textbooks. You may or may not know that. So we've got some good expertise with us. But more importantly, they come as Christians this morning. And they come to give us a Christian perspective on this subject too. So I'm just going to pray and then hand over to Charlie and Claire. Heavenly Father, help us as we come to difficult subjects to know your mind on these things and to know that this is your world and it's your creation and we are yours. And so we pray that you would help us think through tricky issues which are so relevant to our society, and help us know how to respond to them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you all for coming, for getting up early on a Saturday morning. That's a challenge, isn't it? I'm hoping that, some slides will appear shortly. Just want to add that, yes, this is a really important topic, but it can be an emotional topic. All of us come at this topic from a different perspective, a different angle. You will maybe have people on your mind, situations on your mind. We want this to be a safe place for us to address this topic. I hope that will be the case. Obviously, if you do find it emotional and actually find that you just need to step out for a moment, please feel that you can do that. Claire and I, whilst we've given this a lot of thought, we don't have all the answers. And sometimes when you think about a topic a lot, you end up with more questions than answers, and that's okay. And there will be time for questions, as Peter has said, both together as a group, but informally afterwards too. So I deliberately chose perhaps a provocative title, Choice at the End of Life. In fact, that was the wording in Kim Leadbeater's original bill that was proposed in October last year. Having won the ballot in September to be allowed to bring a private member's bill before Parliament, the name subsequently of the bill has changed. But just as an opener, just is Is it right that we have choice about that? Do we have choice? Should we, with this bill, will we have choice at the end of life? Maybe food for thought, even as we begin. So we're going to have just a little thought about some scenarios to kick off the topic. Think about the language that we're being used. Think about the current bill, maybe some lessons from other countries, particularly focusing, there's quite a lot of countries now where legislation is in place. Just think about what lessons we can learn from those, particularly from the state of Oregon in the US and from Canada, who are thought to be their legislation closest or started off closest to the proposed UK legislation. Some concerns from the medical profession and thinking about what does the Bible say. So first of all, something to get you thinking. Actually, I don't know if that can be made. Yeah, maybe that could be made as large as possible. I realise that I probably put too much. So think about the scenarios on the left of the screen, and then which category do you think they fall into? I'll give you 1 minute to think about those scenarios. You're offered a lethal dose of medicine injected by a doctor. Sadly, you're with someone who who's on an intensive care unit maybe, and thought to be brain dead. There's talk about switching off the ventilator. You're being prescribed medication in a lethal overdose, which you can take if you want to, with the intention of ending your life. Or perhaps your loved one is admitted to the hospice, struggling to take medication by mouth anymore, and is given a syringe driver pump with medication for pain relief. I'm not going to make anybody say what they thought about those, but I'll just go through them. The first one, that's what we call euthanasia. Okay? The second scenario may surprise some of you to learn, but that is none of the above. That is D. That is letting nature take its course. You may be removing life-sustaining treatment, but then you're letting nature take its course without the ventilator in place. That is neither A, B, or C. The third one down, being prescribed medication that you can take if you want to. You could describe that as A or C. And the fourth scenario, again, is none of the above. That is palliative care. That is relieving symptoms in a hospice setting. So euthanasia, in fact, was an original Greek word which implied dying well. But now it has other meaning. I'll let you read that. The difference between assisted suicide and assisted dying is subtle. Assisted dying is mainly used for those who are deemed to be terminally ill already. So clearly this topic has been in the press a lot recently. Actually, the picture that's missing is one of Esther Rantzen, who of course was very vocal in the press, and it was the Prime Minister's promise to Esther Rantzen that he would allow parliamentary time to discuss this topic. The Dignitas, common high-profile clinic based in Switzerland, offering assisted dying, assisted suicide. You may be interested to know that by the end of 2023, UK membership of Dignitas was about just close to 1,900 people, just less than 2,000 people. That doesn't mean that many people went there. Actually, only 40 people from the UK went to Dignitas in 2023. Okay? It's costly. It costs anywhere between £10,000 and £15,000 with the trips, assessments, and then going there. The campaign for dignity with dying has been very vocal as well in recent months and years. And in fact, I'm rather sad. Something is playing a tune at me. So sorry. That is actually a campaign in support of assisted dying. And yet it's rather unfortunate because I think that's really what we try to do in hospice and palliative care, is to give dignity with dying. But they do have an interesting website with some interesting stories, and I'm just going to read a little précis of a story just to set the scene of some of the situations that make us think very carefully about this topic. This was written by a lady called Sandy Bryden before she died, and she died in December 2017. The full story is on the website, so this is with her explicit permission that this can be used. So I've just précised her story. Sandy was 57 years old when she wrote her story. She lived in London with her daughter, her son-in-law, and 2 lovely granddaughters, who you can see in the picture. In December 2015, she was sadly diagnosed with cancer in her abdomen. She became seriously unwell and underwent major surgery. By the following April, she'd recovered quite well from that surgery. Her cancer appeared to have gone, and she, in fact, returned to work. However, unfortunately, at her 6-month scan review in August 2016, the news was devastating. Her cancer had returned, and she had inoperable tumours throughout her abdomen. She was offered some chemotherapy, which she accepted, in the knowledge that it wasn't a cure, but maybe it could just hold things at bay for a while. The treatment was brutal, the side effects very difficult. Before she died, she wrote the following: "My thoughts are filled with uncertainty and fear. Fear that my pain and sickness will not be controllable. I think about dying constantly. What will happen if the tumours continue to grow? I don't want my family to see me suffering. I don't want that to be their last memory of me." And Sandy goes on to say that knowing she had the option of an assisted death would relieve some of her fear of what might happen at the end. It's the right one to go forward.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Those are quite powerful stories, aren't they? And they're ones that we've been reading about a lot in the press recently. And they do make us think, do we have to suffer? Is the end always about suffering? Is there another way? And it's those sorts of stories that over the last 20 years have led to societal and legislative pressure to change the law where we live. I think I have a slide. So that brings us to the current bill before Parliament, brought by King Leadbeater, as Charlie said. It passed its second reading on 29th of November, which was Black Friday, by a margin of about 50 MPs. It's currently at its committee stage, receiving oral evidence, and some of you may have been following on Twitter or other social media little excerpts of that, which have been open to the public to see. The committee stage is now finished. They've had just about a week, I think it's just this week of evidence, that's all they're getting, to consider a lot of input from people on both sides, actually. There's a report from the committee due on the 25th of April, and that will go to a third reading. Probably early May. I think the timing depends a bit on the local elections. That's not been decided. And on the 3rd of May, it'll be voted on again. So this is another opportunity for MPs to say yes or no. It's almost like the final choice for the House of Commons. Now, I think it would be unusual for it to be voted into a no, having been yes this far, to be a no at this stage, but it's still possible. It is still possible. It would require 30 MPs to change their mind for that sort of for those numbers to switch. So it's still possible they may change their mind, but it's unlikely. If it passes, it'll then go to the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords could technically, if they could technically turn it down, vote it down, but they won't. And what's happened to bills in the past that the House of Lords haven't liked is that they've timed them out. They put amendment after amendment after amendment. They played the system, but then you run out of parliamentary time. You're not going to run out of parliamentary time for this at the start of a legislative, the first 4 years. So if it goes through the House of Lords, it will, House of Commons, it really will go through the House of Lords. So this is the terminology of the bill. It's been through various iterations over 20 years, and this is the current one for adults resident in the UK in the last 6 months of life, as determined by or guessed at by a doctor. 2 doctors need to check their views, and the patient on 2 separate occasions need to make a declaration. The doctor is meant to decide if there's been any coercion or pressure. And this process will take a minimum of 21 days. That's to allow some kind of cooling off period. However, if you're thought to be imminently dying, it can be expedited. It can go through quicker so that you can have a death at the time of your choosing and don't die naturally beforehand. So it can be fast-tracked. What will then happen is that you'll be provided with a lethal dose of medication, which will be most likely quite a large number of tablets. They don't make tablets in the sort of doses needed that you need to kill yourself, and you will take them yourself. The legislation is a little bit, it's only 30 pages, the bill. It's short on detail, as these things often are. There is some allusion, it's alluded to that a doctor could prepare a medical device to assist, so maybe it'll be some sort of button, but the patient is going to have to do the act of taking the medication at some point. And at the point they take it, the patient has to have capacity, so they have to know what they're doing. So if you are very sleepy or comatose, you won't be able to have it. If you have dementia, that'd be another reason people sometimes seek assisted or an early death. You won't be able to have it if you are at the point of your dementia where you don't know what you're doing at the time. So that's what's proposed. The details of these sorts of things tend to come out in the codes of practice that are published just before they're implemented. So as Charlie said already, there's a number of countries in the world, quite a few European countries, 10 states, the USA, 10 and counting, I think, Australia, New Zealand. So all Europe, all Western countries. I think there's one outlier, which is Colombia. It's the only non-Western only non-developed world country that has this. A lot of countries, still only 5% of the world's population. I always find it interesting, it's the wealthy countries that are choosing this. So the first one, we could literally spend all day talking about the comparative legislation of these different countries, but we'll start with Oregon because it's sort of similar and it's been there the longest. They passed it in 1997. What's noticeable about Oregon, unlike other places, is that the number of deaths by assisted suicide has been stable, about 0.3, 0.8. So in Oregon, like the legislation proposed here, you have to be able to take the medication yourself. You have to be able to swallow it. There's no euthanasia. There's no lethal injection. The percentage of deaths hasn't changed. The absolute number maybe has gone up in the last few years since COVID. The reasons for choosing death have changed over time, with 40% of people citing being a burden. So people can choose more than one reason. There are other reasons people choose, but it's interesting, isn't it? That people aren't saying this on unmanageable pain or dreadful suffering. It's just not being a burden. And we can reflect as to whether we think that's a good reason to die soon. The other difference with Oregon is that patients are given the lethal dose of medication they can keep at home and they can take when they like. So when they take it, you've got no idea what's happening in the home. Basically, you've got no idea who's taking the medication, and you've no idea of the patient's mental state, domestic state, what else might be going on in their house when they take it. So the Leadbeater bill has sought to address that concern by saying, if you're prescribed it, you have to take it straight away. There has to be a doctor or possibly a nurse, some sort of health professional with you while you take it. Then we'll bring Canada. It's been legalized in Canada since 2016, and initially it was only legalized for people with a terminal illness. Now in 2019, after a lot of pressure from campaigners, it was felt that it was extended. So it wasn't just for people who are terminally ill, it's for people who are suffering intolerably, suffering and who don't have a terminal diagnosis. And that includes people with serious disability, and it includes people with mental illness as well as physical illness. So you might have someone who's suffering a great deal of distress from, say, something like anorexia, and they have a physical illness as well, but they can still get assisted suicide. And there is documented, clear evidence from the papers there that some people in Canada have opted to have assisted dying because of the suffering of living with their disability is too great. It's easier to get yourself killed than it is to get yourself a house that meets your needs. And there was a well-known case about a woman who had various sensitivities, needed special housing, and chose this. So, and also in Canada, as in here, it's quite hard to get that support for complex disabilities. People are choosing to die instead. From 2027, so this has been pushed back a bit, they're going to permit assisted dying for people with mental illnesses alone. So that has led to things like depression, grief, and anorexia. So sorts of things that you might hope would be curable or manageable, they're going to be permitting assisted dying or euthanasia. So Canada also permits euthanasia, also permits an injection. What is really striking in Canada is that it was envisaged that in 2016 this would be a small number of deaths. Maybe 100, 200 a year, that sort of thing. It's gone to 15,000. In 5 years, it's gone to being 5% of the deaths. Now, it took Holland 20 years, so the Netherlands would be another case study. We haven't got time for everything. It took Holland 20 years to get to 5% of deaths. It's taken Canada 5 years to get to 5% of deaths. And this is a continuous sort of legislative push where what is conceived of as safeguards then become seen as barriers. So one safeguard, say in the lead beta bill, is that you've got to have capacity at the time you take the tablets. So people with dementia, advanced dementia, are excluded, and that's conceived of as being discriminatory. So the bill is, the terms of the bill are widened. So that's what you can see in Canada. And the reality that the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Office does make calculations that the assisted dying, medical assistance in dying made can save money. So they have to think about, somebody's thinking about those sorts of things. Right back at the beginning, and I don't know if it's still the case, a hospice that declined to provide the assisted dying on site, although there was a hospital 2 miles up the road who had its funding withdrawn from the government because institutions couldn't opt out of providing it. An individual doctor or nurse might say, I can't be involved, but they said institutions have to provide it on site. So we don't know what's going to happen with the current legislation. It might be that all hospitals have to provide it. Oak Haven might have to provide it. We don't know, but there's unlikely to be an institutional conscientious objection or opt-out. So that's where we are. So I'm going to just step away from sort of concerns from around the world to look at concerns from the medical profession. You've probably all heard of the sort of Hippocratic Oath. I didn't actually have to swear this when I became a doctor. I had to swear not to burn down the library, funnily enough, but not this. But it still sort of underpins and underlies sort of what the reason that most people go into medicine is to use their power to help the sick to the best of their ability and judgment, and to abstain from harming or wronging any. And the idea behind that being that doctors aren't there to kill their patients or to give them that lethal overdose of medicine and sit with them while they do it themselves. So I think, and those of you who've been following this in the media will see most of the arguments against focus around the vulnerable people at the end of their lives, people who are perhaps elderly, people who feel a burden. Yes, this might be a choice for some who are quite vocal, who are clear and set in their minds, but for the lonely, for those without social support, for those who come from complex families with tricky family dynamics, for those who might live in situations of domestic abuse that we know nothing about. How can we know, and how can a doctor know? Now, the legislation says you have to be seen by 2 doctors, But that doctor doesn't need to know you. That doctor could see you for 45 minutes, you sign your declaration, you go away 2 weeks, you see another doctor who's never met you before, sees you for 45 minutes, you sign the declaration. So we're okay, we're good at talking to people, we're good at having complex discussions, but I've got no idea what happens behind someone's closed doors. I've only met them for 45 minutes. So these safeguards perhaps aren't as safe as they might sound. This sort of stuff is really hard to pick up, and there's nothing that stops you, quote, sort of doctor shopping, it's sometimes called, that get turned down. Once you can go see another doctor. So at the end, I mentioned a documentary, and there's a documentary that's on the BBC last year, and they go and interview someone in Canada. It's actually quite a balanced documentary, it gives both sides, but it's done by Liz Carr, who's a disability rights campaigner, and she went and interviewed someone in Canada, and the daughter said, my mum had depression, she had lots of complex things. The 5th doctor signed her off. I couldn't believe. 4 doctors said no, the 5th doctor said she could have it. So, you can perhaps go and find someone who'll agree with you eventually. For disabled people, this is quite frightening for some, not for all. For some disabled people, they'll find this as an opportunity to express autonomy and choice. But for others, they just know that people see them in a wheelchair and already think, well, your life's not worth living very much, is it? So they fear that will just be extended into agreeing for their assisted death, whereas if they weren't in a wheelchair, we perhaps might suggest they take other options first. I think there's a great deal of concern that trust, doctor-patient trust, clinicians, if it becomes nurses who can do this too, might be greatly threatened, especially if a doctor suggests. There's a lot of debate about whether doctors should be able to bring up the topic of assisted dying. So in New Zealand, where it's legalised, the doctor is not allowed to say, have you thought about assisted suicide or assisted dying? So they're not allowed to bring it up. The patient has to bring it up. For some doctors working in those environments, they say it's a bit weird because you sort of feel like you're skirting this big elephant in the room. But that's meant to protect against the idea that if the doctor says to you, have you thought about assisted dying? Then you go, oh, wow, I must be such a bad case. Or maybe the doctor knows I'm going to die horribly, or what aren't they telling me? Perhaps I better agree because they must know something I don't know. So it was to protect against that. But you can see how it makes communication, even just talking this issue, potentially quite fraught. And the final thing is sometimes, the law is a blunt instrument, isn't it? And sometimes the best barrier is a solid one. So as soon as we move some of these as soon as we say yes to some people, how do you stop it expanding? So for a blunt instrument, protect extension to children. So as many of you know, children can be euthanized in Belgium and in Holland. It's been going on for decades. And people with non-terminal illness, those who are tired in life. There's quite a pressure in Holland and Belgium. If you're just tired of life, you've had enough. You can get state-sponsored or state-assisted euthanasia or assisted suicide. So those concerns are all there. I mean, we do have another choice. I think sometimes if you listen to the campaigning, you'd think, well, your choice is a horrible death or your choice is an assisted suicide. So sometimes it's sort of felt like it's been presented like that. There is another way. We have the other way. I mean, sometimes it feels difficult that, say, the NHS isn't in a great place at the moment, but it does offer good care. It is struggling. GPs are struggling. Social care needs proper funding. I'm not going to get into a political discussion about how we do that, but, a lot of the wish is that if a lot of the feeling is that we're a burden, and many will have struggled with finding appropriate care for their loved ones, and that huge strain and burden, I think, as a society, if we're putting people through that, how much do we value them? So we could properly fund all these things. Palliative care is generally 30% funded by the NHS, by the state. The rest is done by legacies and cake sales. I think O'Caven is 90% funded by you, literally by what you donate. If we're looking at this becoming legalised, assisted suicide becoming legalised, it will be 100% funded. The suggestion is to be 100% funded by the NHS. So, we could choose a little bit where we spend our money, what's important to us. So there are these options already. There is more that we can do. I realise I'm racing kind of throwing lots of things here and then moving on to different subjects. But I mean, what does the Bible say? We're here in a church context. We want to know what God says about this. And we know that God has created each of us in his own image. Each of us has a spark of the divine with us. in us, and as such, each of us is infinitely valuable. So we see killing right, well, unfortunately it appears in Genesis, doesn't it? First murder of Cain and Abel, but and that deeply, deeply hurts God. And throughout the Old Testament, we see repeatedly that killing of innocent people is profoundly breaks God's heart and is forbidden. We see elsewhere that all life is a gift from God. It's very valuable. The sense that God brings death in his own time. He numbers our days. He knows them before we are born. He determines the length of our days. That's therefore not to say that we should pursue all medical treatment options to the nth degree. You know, the purpose of medicine is primarily to promote holistic life and health, not to prolong a dying process by chasing after increasingly futile medical treatments that can't achieve their goals. So it's not meaning that we have to live at all costs. That's partly the role of palliative care, is to try and walk that middle way a little bit. We can cry out to someone, how long, O Lord? We're not made for aging and decay, and they are hard to live through. But whether that means we should be killing ourselves is perhaps something else. And then there's that argument of protecting the weak and the vulnerable. You know, as a society, our main concern, and how we are perhaps judged as a society, is what we do for those least able to protect themselves and have a voice for themselves. And we know that death isn't the end. We know that death has been defeated, that death, through Jesus and his resurrection, we know that Jesus understands what it's like to suffer and live our lives, and we know that there will be victory in the end. But I'll let you read that quote. That's just at the bottom. I think that might be, I can't remember who did that quote. So death comes, with death we meet our Maker, and for different people that will have different consequences. And I don't know if that's something that we wish to expedite for everyone. So we're not without hope. We worship the God of love and hope. We can do things as individuals. We can do things as a group of churches. We can just support and love and show love to one another. We can support people going through this sort of thing. We can pray. We can pray right now. I mean, this bill isn't law yet. We can pray for how it may proceed, what may happen next. And we can trust that God is sovereign over this and pray for his mercy. Great. Good. We're going to leave it there. I think we might have time for questions. Great. Thank you.
As well at this point, and could we just first of all show our appreciation to both Charlie and Claire for extremely helpful, detailed, sensitive handling of a difficult subject. Thank you both so much. And now is an opportunity. We've got 10 or so minutes for any questions. These are the things that you might want to know. Charlie and Claire have covered a whole range of things, but there may be something that you're particularly interested in that you'd like to just raise, or a point to make on the subject. So I'll bring the mic around. Margaret.
Without any assistance and a great deal of prayer, could I just stop eating, and how long would it take, and would it be very painful?
So I guess it depends whether you stop drinking as well. You'll remember, perhaps I remember from the news items in I think it was the 1980s, when there were IRA hunger strikers in prison who went on for many months, actually, having just stopped eating. Yes, not a pleasant experience at all, I think, for them. Going without fluids, it's very hard to resist the desire to drink. So thirst is a much stronger driver than hunger. And so if you were to overcome that and stop drinking, then it would be a shorter time, but it could still be a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Margaret. Anyone else would like to ask? Yeah. Is it Henry?
In view of the fact that Paul says our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, what should we think?
Great question. Great question. I mean, I think, again, that it emphasizes to me that, yes, that we have, I think the phrase you used was a spark of the divine in us. And therefore, yes, we are all made in God's image. We have that spark of the divine within us. And therefore, that's something that should be valued and respected, I think.
I'm struggling to see where that question is coming from, but I think we kind of need to look after our bodies. That we need to nurture them, look after them as best we can. I don't think there's a biblical mandate for killing, and that would include suicide. So I don't know if that's where that one's going. Thank you.
At the back.
It's a question and a comment, really. I've read quite a bit of the legislation, but it's not clear whether, if this goes through and the procedure starts, if the person's allowed a family member with them as well. Because a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people like someone they know with them when they're dying. And I think that will be a question for us as individuals, whether we agree with someone's decision or not, whether we'll be prepared to be alongside them while it happens.
In the legislation, you could have whoever you wanted with you. There would be a requirement that a health professional needs to be, if not in the same room, immediately available. So not in a GP, not down the road, literally next door. And then, yes, I think it would then come down to a personal choice as to whether you felt emotionally or morally that you could be with someone in that situation. And I think that would present a challenge across many families.
Question from Andy.
My question is, what form of medication would you, as a doctor, prefer to give in the final analysis? In tablet form or in liquid form? Would you be the person to make the choice? Perhaps you could give some idea on that.
If you talk about the medicine for suicide, those are sort of closely guarded secrets. They're not published what they give because they don't want people sort of shopping online and buying them and doing it themselves. But it's usually things like diazepam, which is a sedative, phenobarbital, which is an old-fashioned anti-epileptic, a couple of maybe a dose of opioids, high dose of opioids, things. So the idea is it stops you breathing. It makes you unconscious and it stops you breathing. Takes half an hour to 2.5 hours to die, maybe longer if you vomit up some of the medication. It will be set out exactly what those are, and the set pharmacies will provide those sort of supply of drugs. It will probably be as tablets or liquids. Not all of them come as liquids, so for some patients it might be trying to dissolve. And I think when you read some of the stories of people in Oregon, it could be as much as 50 tablets which you try and dissolve. Don't always dissolve in water, some you have to dissolve in sort of sugary solutions. Quite hard to ingest. Hence that allusion to maybe a situation where you could press a button and something could go in. But yeah, not easy to take that number of medicines because they're not really designed. They're not made in those sorts of doses. Is that what you were asking? Yeah.
But the time it takes for somebody to die, again, if you look at reports from places where this is, legal already, it is huge. There are reports of people taking days to die. And some people where they don't die. They take what is apparently a lethal dose of medicine, but they don't die.
Jackie's got a question over here.
Will the medical professional, nurses, pharmacists, anyone involved be allowed to object and not be involved?
There will be a conscientious objection clause. It's very hard to know how far that will go. Usually it's limited to the people immediately in the room. So the doctors and the nurses, but then if it's a nurse on shift in a hospital or a hospice and you're involved in their care and you can't leave the ward and somebody's off sick, then there'll be practicalities around that sort of ongoing care. You might be able to say no to a particular bit of the process, but if you're the only nurse in the ward and something goes wrong, you might be there. And then the further you get from the patient, even though you might be involved in the process, you won't be able to object. So probably pharmacists won't be able to conscientiously object to preparing the tablets. People involved in more distant ways are admin, people processing the paperwork, who still might feel they don't want to be involved, won't be able to object because the conscientious objection clauses aren't that wide. Yeah.
But as a doctor, as an individual doctor, you will be able to conscientiously object. If I find I have a conversation with a patient about, a little bit like my time in general practice when somebody might approach me about having an abortion, a termination of pregnancy, I was never obliged to have to sign the form to say that I would sanction it. But obviously I have a duty of care and responsibility for the patient in front of me. I would always discuss it with them. But if the individual was determined that no, that was the path that they wanted to take, then I had an obligation to then refer them to somebody else who would be able to do that for them.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of the church is we have to respond to the way the world is, not the way we'd like it to be. And on the basis this might well happen, we should be prepared as a church for how we respond to it. I'm just wondering what sort of practical things. I mean, should we have a bigger support and link to palliative care processes, or should we be doing other stuff that actually helps? Because I think the church can have a really positive response into this when it happens, but just wondering any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think we can respond individually as Christians in supporting people who are going through these last weeks, years, months of life. We can do that individually, we can do that corporately. Even things like Cameo are important. I even put that in there, but things like Cameo are important, just having that lunch that shows value to people. So those sorts of things we can do. It will become a pastoral issue, as in, should I go for assisted dying if I'm in the last 6 months? There will be those questions to respond to. I mean, I think as a Christian, I think the biblical case is pretty clear. But there will be people who are torn around that, or whose family members are uncertain. So, that gets harder. That gets harder to support. I wouldn't be encouraging people to pursue it, but know that people might make some decisions like that, and we need to love and embrace them. So.
And I think responding to the feeling that people have of being a burden, if we see situations which are hard work for people in caring for loved ones towards the end of their life, then we should be reaching out to support the vulnerable, support those who are feeling that burden maybe, and seeing how we as a community can share that burden. I was struck by the fact that I noticed afresh just that 17% of people in Canada expressed loneliness as a factor in making them seek medical assistance in dying. And surely that's a role for us as a community to reach out to those who may be lonely. As you say, I think there's a lot that the church community could be doing.
I think just as follow-up, I think it's unlikely to say abortion. This is something that's going to face anybody who's 6 months from death, so there'll be all of us at some point, sooner or later, will have this as an option. It will become a choice or a burden of choice. So it's a much wider societal impact, so I think we need to be thinking about that. So thank you, John. And I think I read it, didn't have time to put it in here, but I had quite a good quote from Lord Sumption, who's on this committee and presented evidence. He just said, as a society, we present a really negative image of aging, dying, and being ill. that's how we choose to present, that you're a burden, that it's really bad, that there's no way back, that the world is for the young and the absolutely healthy. So I do think there is room for us to address that.
We'll have to finish there formally on the questions. Thank you so much. But I think Charlie and Claire are going to stay around if you'd like to come to the front afterwards and discuss any other questions that you might have. But can we just say a big thank you again to both of you for your time this morning. And I'm going to hand over to David now, who's going to give a couple of quick notices and wrap us up for today. Just to mention, as well as questions at the front, there will be that opportunity for prayer ministry if you'd like to head to the chapel for that, if you'd like to pray about anything that's been raised this morning. Thank you.
Can I add my thanks as well to Charlie and Claire? It's a very challenging subject, one that we all need to think about. And you've given us such a lot of insight. A lot more questions, not necessarily all answers, but that's always the way with difficult subjects. And as one of the members of the congregation, I'm not as old as some, but I'm a lot older than some. It's obviously something that could be close to me making my mind up before too long. So, I've got here the dates of our next two men's breakfasts. The next one's on the 5th of April, and Isaac Ashley's speaking then. He's one of our team in our office. So, gentlemen, if you've not got the dates of the next two, please grab one of these from me before you go, and we will hope to see you. One of the things Peter and I briefly spoke about, this idea of having a church breakfast open to everybody, it seems to work very well. We haven't had one there for at least a couple of years, but maybe it's something we should think about maybe doing annually. So maybe next year, and one of the possible speakers we talked about, Peter and I, would be maybe the Bishop of Southampton. So we hope that maybe this format we could use occasionally. And if everybody feels that's a good idea, please feed back to us and let us know. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming. And anybody who likes to help clear up afterwards, you'd be very welcome. So thank you again to our two speakers, Claire and Charlie.